Hello and welcome to this BCS IT Leaders Forum, Creating a New Work World. My name is John Edwards and I'm delighted to introduce our panel of speakers this afternoon. From the Leeds University Business School, Afshan Iqbal is a doctoral researcher, Dr. Matthew Davis is an associate professor and chartered psychologist, and Dr. Helen Hughes is a chartered occupational psychologist. Together they will share with us an overview of the existing academic research and identify emerging trends forecasting what this will mean for the future of the traditional office. Hannah Nardini is one of the UK's leading workplace strategists, and she'll use the available data to explore different perspectives on remote working and discuss the predictors for the future. Mark Bland is head of test at Premier Farnell and has been a people manager for a decade. He will discuss how COVID-19 has leveled the playing field for remote workers and how we can retain the advantages when COVID recedes into the past. And finally, Ali Jarosky and Jamie Toyne are business analysts at DWP. Their community has evolved significantly over the period, and they also have seen improved engagement and strengthened community spirit. The challenge now is to build that into the future and retain the improvement in the longer term. We will have a Q&A session after the presentations with our speaker panel, so please note your questions in the chat panel on the side of your screen as we go through the session, and we'll deal with as many as we can before the event closes at 5:30. So I'll hand over the screen now and welcome our first speakers, Afshan Iqbal, Matthew Davis and Helen Hughes.
Hi, afternoon there. Can you hear me all right? Thanks a lot, John. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Afshan and I'm a doctoral researcher here at the Leeds University Business School. And I'm joined today by my colleagues, Matt and Helen, who I'll pass you on to shortly. So my research is focusing around how people adapt to working from home or working virtually, away from your traditional office settings, and how technology is being used to facilitate this way of working. I just want to check, can everybody see my screen?
No, I think the slides aren't full screen yet, Afshan.
Oh, apologies. See?
Slides are showing, Afshan, they're just not in presentation mode.
Hold on 1 second.
That's it. Thank you.
There we go. See, technological difficulties still going on a year later. So, looking at working from home and, well, the journey so far, I guess. So, prior to COVID-19, what did it look like working from home? How prevalent was it? Well, the Office for National Statistics released some data that showed that only 5% of the UK working population worked from home mainly throughout the year of 2019. And what they found also was that about 26% had some experience of working from home throughout the year, but it wasn't something that they did regularly. And what we also know is that the working from home privileges were often based on a person's perhaps level of experience within a company, their tenure or level of seniority. Or it might have been dependent on the sectors that you find yourselves working in. So for instance, perhaps if you worked in IT or professional or financial services, for instance, you perhaps had more experience of working from home, and you were perhaps less likely to work from home if you engaged in manual work, or perhaps if you were, for those that are younger or less experienced workers. So how has the pandemic changed this? Well, what we found was that by April 2020, almost half of the UK population found themselves working from home as a result. And as the year went on, as restrictions started to ease in some parts, we found that it averaged out to about 37% of the working population were working from home. So we saw that there's over a 10% increase from the year before. So what have we learned then through people's from people's experiences over the course of the past year? Well, we've seen many benefits of this, and some of the key ones that we're seeing emerge through the data is that workers are enjoying an increased flexibility in their day-to-day working lives. So, for instance, they found that they're able to structure their working day to a way that works for them and suits their needs better. So they're left to their own devices a lot more, and they've experienced greater autonomy as a result of that. And so what we're also then seeing is reports of an enhanced work-life balance. So we've been able to cut out this dreaded daily commute of having to, navigate our ways through rush hour traffic every morning and fighting for our place on a train. That's all gone. So it means that we've got more time for leisure activities, more time to engage in hobbies, spending more time with the family, and allowing us to be more productive because we're able to structure our working days to suit us. So, for instance, being able to start a little bit later to work in with to factor in the school runs, for instance. But then on the flip side of that, whilst we've seen that a lot of people have reported to have a positive impact on their work-life balance, it's also been challenging for many other people as well. So people have reported that it's become quite difficult to separate between work and home because you're living and working within the same space. So it becomes harder to detach from work at the end of the day as boundaries have become increasingly more blurred. And also, through challenges of perhaps caring responsibilities have all, so everything's almost collided between your work and your personal life. So that's been quite a big challenge for many people. And similarly, in terms of finding it difficult to detach has also led to what we call techno stress. So where people are finding it difficult to adapt to technologies in a healthier manner. So for instance, if we're seeing that our work devices, our laptops and computers are within the same room as, where we're watching TV, it's quite easy to just log on and send a few emails. So it just means that we risk being more connected to work and therefore finding it difficult to distance ourselves, which can also lead to working longer hours. And then again, that can have potential for burnout as well if it's not managed carefully. So all of these can contribute towards, can have knock-on effects on your individual productivity and your well-being as well. And then some of the demographic trends that we're seeing is that over the course of the year that we've seen is younger people have reported that going forwards, as we start to ease our way out of this pandemic, they would prefer to be in the office a little bit more compared to older and more experienced workers. And some of the reasons for this could be that for the social side of it, those spontaneous conversations and to be able to build a rapport and build some relationships with people that you're working with, especially if you're new to an organisation, you might not have had those opportunities to do that. And then also, again, access to training and development opportunities as well. So that's something that younger people have emphasised a lot more of, or a desire to have more access to that. And then also for some people, space is also an issue as well. So not everybody has the luxuries of having a spare room that they can convert into an office. So in those instances, those individuals might prefer to work in the office more so that they've got the right space and they've got, they can separate the two environments better. And then what we're also starting to see in the data is that those that have perhaps got young dependents or have caring responsibilities, they have stated a higher preference of spending more time working from home and only going into the office when they need to for meetings and for things that they can't do from home. That's also been really interesting, and so we're seeing quite a mix there. And then also, just quickly moving on from that, is that we see that we all know that, we're all talking about the fact that working from home is here to stay for the foreseeable, or that we're going to be perhaps using the office differently, and my colleagues will be touching upon that. But, if we are going to find ourselves working from home a little bit more, We've also been seeing people sharing about some of their tips of how they've been managing this over the pandemic. So again, some of the interesting points that individuals have been doing is just being more mindful of creating their own structures and routines that work best for them. So again, I've touched upon before that, you don't have to be at your desk at 9 AM if it's not mandatory. So being able to find a time that works for you to get the work done, and being able to take regular breaks as well, because if you're living at home, you're living and working from the same environment, it's almost easy to get carried away and to continue working. So just to be able to be mindful of, your own working practices, and to be able to be kinder to yourself, to be able to know when to take a step back and to take breaks. And again, that's something that people have been reporting that they've become a lot more conscious of as they've got as we've got further into the pandemic, just because they've noticed their own behaviours of being stuck at the desks a lot more. And again, finally, just in terms of how do we ensure that those that are working from home feel like they are part of a wider team, and not left on their own, so to speak. So again, just being from a management perspective, just be more mindful of those that are at home, and to be able to engage in regular communication with them, to be able to facilitate regular catch-ups with the team, and also individual one-to-ones, so that people don't feel like that they're left alone to deal with things by themselves. Again, because we're not engaging in these spontaneous conversations as we would do in the office. So we do have to make more conscious efforts to be able to create those team environments from a distance, essentially. I'm going to leave it there for now, and I will hand you over to my colleague Helen.
Hello, thanks very much, Afshan. It's really interesting, and I'm going to try and pick up on a couple of things that you've said during that presentation. Just before I do that, just introduce myself again. I'm Helen. I work with Matt and Afshan, and the projects that are going to follow now. So this one and the next one, Matt and I are sort of both quite involved in. So we can sort of tag team this, I think. This first project that I want to introduce to you is a project that we've been that we started this last year. One of the roles I have in the business school is to look after our students who do a year-long internship in industry. They're usually paid, they're usually between 9 and 12 months. And every year, this is quite a staple of a business degree. You're probably quite familiar with it in maybe your own organisations. But these particular students are really interesting because they represent a really big proportion of the working world collectively. When you think about the number of people that are beginning their careers in a pandemic, so when you think about school leavers, new graduates, and in this case interns, there's a whole sort of cross section of society that's beginning to work in quite a different environment. And so in this project, we've been collecting data over the last year to look at how our interns have experienced the start of their career when they've been working in organisations. And these are just a snapshot of some of the findings I want to talk about today. The next slide, please. So the first thing to think about is really the value of a workspace. So if you think back traditionally, we all have workspaces that we are used to and familiar with, but the fortunate thing we've got is also very often is work experience. But actually a workspace gives us quite a lot of different things. So in the immediate sense, it gives us cues about who has the big office, what the hierarchy might then look like. Gives us cues about who's busy, who we should disturb, who we shouldn't disturb. It tells us a little bit about the norms around breaks, around starting time and end time in the workplace, and so on. And it also gives us a lot of cues about the culture, the sort of softer side of the workplace. And this is work that Matt here has done a lot of work on in the past, looking at the role that the infrastructure plays in how we experience our jobs. And so for the first time, as Afshan's mentioned, people are entering the workplace this year without those cues in a large proportion of cases. And so the question we started this project with was, well, how do you then harness those, the kind of value you get from a workplace if you don't have access to that workplace at all? Can I have the next slide, Afshan, please? Sorry. The first thing to sort of say here is that there's an immediate value to a workspace, and there's also a slightly longer term thing. So the immediate value, when I was interviewing some of our interns, they were talking about how they, because fortunately some of them had managed to go for interviews and assessment centres before the pandemic hit. And they were saying things like, that the culture of the organisation and their sense of how they fit into that was really clear just from going to the assessment centre. Someone, as you can see in this pink speech bubble, described it as almost like a customer journey. They talked about, you've got street clinic boards and upcoming modules, upcoming launches. You know straight away as you walk in that this company is this particular company. It's very reflective of the company, and I knew it was for me. And they've talked about that before they've even set foot in there as an employee. So the workspace is giving them that kind of vibe. Another student talked about the sheer excitement of it. So going into the physical workspace for the first time, oh, wow, this is amazing. I've got a placement here. Makes you feel really lucky and fortunate. And it was an inspirational kind of build-up. And somebody else talked about the pride that they got from working there. So all of these things are immediately obvious and available to people in their workplace. But there's also a slightly more longer term influence of a workspace, which is something I want to talk about in a moment. And that's the way that the workspace helps you get to know people, and in turn helps you work out what, not only who you know, but what you come to know as a product of who you know. And that's something that our students, as I'll come to, feel like they have perhaps missed a little bit this year. Can I have the next slide, Ashton, please? We collected, as part of this study, some initial information. I thought, given the audience here, it might be interesting for you to see the kind of modes of communication that our new workers are saying they have. So interestingly, most of them have been co-located, even when they've been working hybrid, maybe towards the end of the placement, for just about 13%. That's quite generous. Most of them have not really worked in a workplace at all. And then the modes of communication, you can see there's a lot of scheduled video meetings, not a great surprise, probably to most of us. And there's quite a lot of quick online chats. But there are other sort of mechanisms for communication as well. And in the interviews, lots of students talked a lot about the value of the kind of the backstory, the WhatsApp, the text that was going on behind the meetings as maybe the meeting was going on. Can I have the next slide? So this is just a kind of an initial summary. There's loads more. I'm sort of scratching the surface a little bit here, but some of the sort of downsides of working remotely for people in this early stage of their career. They've talked a lot about the challenges of knowing how busy other people are and maybe not knowing how busy other people are, and making assumptions because of their naivety about what the workplace is about. And saying, I don't like to disturb people, and maybe that's come back to them as being a problem because they haven't disturbed people. It's difficult sometimes to know how you can be visible when you are effectively invisible for a long period of the day. Learning those office norms that we talked about, particularly as Afshan mentioned, around the start and end of the day, knowing when it's okay to take a break, knowing when it's okay to finish your working day. Our new interns described that as really difficult, feeling like they should be visible all the time, but not really knowing how to do that. A lot of them talked about how later in their internship, they found it much easier to say when they're overwhelmed or when they're bored and don't have anything to do, but how that's taken a really long time to get comfortable with. So at the start of their placement, one of our interns described how difficult it was to feel like she just didn't know the pace of work because you don't get that visibility from the workspace. And they also described a lot of challenges, as you might expect, around understanding acronyms, understanding the office lingo as they described it, dealing with ambiguity, and crucially also making friends. And I want to just mention that in just a moment before I wrap up. On the plus side, though, I don't want to sort of portray that everything was a downside. And a couple of our interviewees mentioned how learning, how they've been able to sort of demonstrate their learning I found it quite a surprising way. They were saying that, you know, they would be able to get given a project and they'd run with it. They'd ask their family and friends for guidance because they didn't want to ask their work colleagues necessarily. And then they'd deliver something, maybe a presentation that was quite impressive. And they described how there was, they found that a bit advantageous because had they been in the office, they might have, you know, seemed to be floundering, but actually they looked quite seamless in their work. They also talk about avoiding the shackles of the hierarchy because they don't know who's important, so they just contact people. And that, you know, if you are particularly proactive, that, you know, they described how that was quite nice, that they don't know who's got the big office and they don't know who they shouldn't disturb. Some people also described the opportunities to attend meetings that they wouldn't have had chance to because the rooms wouldn't have been big enough before, you know, really simplistic stuff. But, you know, they could go to a meeting that might have been reserved for somebody more senior than them just to observe it and get that experience. And the same applied then to more global projects than maybe they would have had the opportunity to get exposed to had they have been in the office. The next slide, please. And so this was really the big one, and I just want to sort of finish by thinking about the one thing for, you know, for an audience like yourselves to think about is how the big thing that people talked about was the challenges of creating those kind of water cooler moments when you don't have a water cooler literally to go to. Somebody, I've just got a couple of quotes on here that I'll just sort of leave us to think about. They were, you know, I think you'd have those off the cuff conversations. Well, almost every conversation I have now is planned. I'm coming to this conversation with something to inform you, or I need something. Whereas I can see you at the coffee machine. I don't have an agenda right now, and we can talk freely. There is nothing happening. That's not really happening, sorry, because you join a meeting, you need to communicate X, Y, and Z, and you've got half an hour. So that was one thing that really people seem to be missing. And I have to say, as someone who's worked in organisations a long time, that's something I feel like I'm missing too, so perhaps not unique. And another thing they talked about, though, and I think this is important for new employees, was this thing about hearing stuff in the office and knowing what's going on and just going, oh, is that what you're talking about? Let me join in. Another slightly more concerning point from my side was the fact that some of our new interns maybe don't appreciate the value of those informal conversations, perhaps because of their lack of experience. So they would, so one in particular said, you know, I want to achieve as best as I can, and I won't go about that, about achieving that by having willy-nilly conversations here and there. So they just didn't see the point of it. And actually, you know, I think most of us would agree that that is important. Final point, because I'm aware of time. So these were just things that I think organisations in the, you know, in this world need to think about. Networks are important for belonging as well as just doing the job. So it's important we don't just think that, you know, we only need people to speak to each other to get the job done. If you don't want people to leave, they also need to feel like they belong in the organisation. We also hear quite a lot, and I think Matt this will resonate with our other project as well, that communication within teams has been sort of harnessed quite well during the pandemic, I think, by and large, but between teams and the wider organisation, that's the bit that our interns don't feel they've necessarily had exposure to. And I think organisations can help their recruits more to kind of build those networks. I also just really wanted to finish by saying that your online tools are now a crucial part of your branding. So in the same way as the workplace before was that wow factor of, you know, I come into this organisation and this is what I see, your online platforms are now what our interns and new graduates are seeing, and new employees. So perhaps that's just something to think about, to leave you with. I'll leave it there, Matt. Over to you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Helen and Action. I think you make my life easy coming last here. Pick up on what you've been saying, and hopefully it might even appear like we all talk to each other occasionally and are researching this together. I'm going to do a really terrible Chris Whitty impression as we go through, and also be asking for the next slide. I apologise, we're not confident enough to have 3 different kind of sets of PowerPoint running as we go through. So I'm Matt Davis, as said at the start, so work very closely with Afshan and Helen. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we're seeing going on in terms of actual office design and particularly kind of organisations thinking about the return to the office or the wider return to the office that's going on at the moment, and what we think are some of the big questions to actually be thinking about in the medium term for what happens next, essentially. I'm also going to do a bit of a plug at the end for our project, because we're still looking for more people to take part if you're interested. So I apologise now, but that's coming at the end. So our starting point really for the, go back, sorry. So our starting point really for the project we're doing and really just our thinking around this topic at the moment is all of the discussion that we've been seeing in the business press and newspapers over the past 15 months or so. People, I guess, calling for the or kind of calling the end of the office as we know it. We've been able to work remotely so productively and so seamlessly in many cases that the case for an office is gone. Right through to the other side where people are saying, well, Dyson and others, and looking at some of the large investment banks, just for them, culture-wise, innovation-wise, you know, we can't function without having this physical space. And it got us thinking really in terms of how do we start to understand what the right balance might be, or who benefits from being within an office space, what kind of proportion of time is online practical for most people, what are the potential trade-offs we're seeing here? And that's influencing what we've been doing. And I think if I just kind of take you back a moment to some of the stats that Afshan was running through, about 45% or so of people over the course of the pandemic who were still working and hadn't been furloughed were working from home. That's a massive increase in the absolute number of people who were home working, but the number of people who are being allowed to homework for the first time. And I think this has been the biggest change looking at the last year, is just the sheer range of jobs, roles, seniority, and so on, who've had the opportunity to work from home and seen this as a possibility. So I think it's completely blown apart the kind of old notions around what jobs could or couldn't be done on or off-site, but also who could or couldn't be trusted to do these also. So I think it's really, really exciting. And from the organisations we work with, I think they're excited as well about what this opens up in terms of possibilities for how we design jobs, ways of working, and the spaces or tools we need to use to do those. So what comes next? Well, looking at the survey data, it's data from CBRE, the British Council of Offices, and plenty of other industry data as well, pretty consistent over the last year, suggesting the majority of employees want at least a day a week in the office. And actually, when you look at it, it's the majority who want about 50-50 split of their time in the office. So they obviously feel like they're missing something we've seen from this. So what might be going on and why might we be seeing that? Well, Helen's touched on some of the things here around potentially kind of missing those networks, those opportunities to see others, maybe in terms of just wanting a kind of different scene and a break in that sense. So if we're looking at having a much more fluid arrangement of whether working home or on site, what does that mean for the office itself? Next slide, please, Sasha. And we're stealing these shamelessly with credit from WeWork to have some nice images. And if you want to advance it one more time, Afshan. So we're seeing, I think, an acceleration of the trend that was here for a good 10 years or so before the pandemic, but this has really supercharged what was going on. So seeing much more kind of interest in redesigning current office space or changing leases across industry, across sectors actually. Moving away from this notion of individual desks for employees and the notion that you'd be in 5 days a week. Exploring new models, so maybe having kind of central hubs, so HQ hubs maybe in major cities, and thinking about these as collaboration centres. So this question of what would employees come in for, why would they leave home? And a lot of the discussion is around what people want kind of interaction, that's what people are missing. Face-to-face collaboration, the kind of things Helen was talking about earlier. Different task base, a lot less individual workspace, and then potentially also neighbourhoods kind of offices or kind of co-working spaces. So kind of a hub and spoke model, moving some offices closer to people, so that if they don't have adequate kind of workspace at home, they've got other areas locally to travel into without having to commute. Next slide, please. And if you can advance it again, yep. Oh, fantastic. We go back one. So in general, kind of the trend we're seeing then in terms of offices which are being retained and being refurbed, looking to, again, reduce the amount of individual desk space, increase kind of collaboration space, bring in, again, much more kind of soft furnishings, bring in some of the domestic finishes that people have got used to at home over this past year into the office space, much more kind of collaborative technologies, mobile technologies as well, maybe kind of individual focused workspaces, but very much moving away from the old models of an office being a desk and that's a place you stay static through the course of the day. Next slide, please. So what are the unknowns and what are the potential things we're thinking about during this journey then? So I think it's very easy, and we're seeing some quite big decisions being made at the moment based on, I think, assumptions about what we're going to need to support work going forwards. And some of these kind of refurbishments and changes in lease are not cheap, as I'm sure you're aware. So what do we need to be thinking about? Well, I think the first thing is a lot of the data that we're basing these decisions on, so people's preferences around how often they want to be in the office, about what types of tasks are we doing, are based upon their assumptions of how they work now during the pandemic when they're remote working, which is not typical. I think we can all agree that. They're also based on assumptions about what the office was like when they left back in March 2020 in many cases, which again might be quite a different environment to one they're returning to. And it's also based on the idea of how they want to work without really understanding what the pattern of their colleagues, their supervisors, the people they're dependent on at work may also be doing. My preference to work 2 days a week in the office might change rapidly if my colleagues are in on different days or if my manager is in 4 days, 5 days a week. So some of these might change very, very quickly as we get more people come back full-time into the workplace, or the opportunity to come back full-time. I think also we need to be mindful of maybe differential effects across different groups. So there's evidence emerging already that women are much less likely to be returning to the workplace where they have the opportunity to do so. So what does this mean? That could be positive in terms of balancing work life and kind of home demands, but it might also mean that we're reinforcing kind of gender inequality in terms of domestic duties and reinforcing cliques and lacking opportunities. I think we've got big management challenges in terms of how we balance occupancy and demand. So if we're allowing people to choose when they come into work, then how do we smooth that across the week if we're also looking to make better use of the office space we retain? So either reducing the amount of office or reducing the number of individual spaces and so on in those. How do we do that without undermining the autonomy and the flexibility that people say they really like about home working? If we start to set up rota systems or limit the number of days you can come in. Next slide, please. And I thought I'd just drop this in, given the audience. So this is data that's been published as a working paper. Some colleagues over in the US studying a large number of staff at an Asian information systems supplier. And they found, I think this is interesting just to bear in mind about potentially hidden costs and lagging effects, which is also something that exercises me in terms of we've managed to keep going and keep productivity up, but what are the costs and what are maybe the lagging costs and implications of this? So they found really extensive data set that people home working during the pandemic, productivity had maintained, brilliant, okay, kept that up. But number of working hours had increased substantially. And when you look at the two together, actually kind of resulting in a 20% drop in productivity for the hours worked. And that cost was being borne by the employees who were working the longer hours. So I think there's an issue here. And I think it flags up the thing that Helen mentioned as well around the need to plan interactions, because we don't have the office to allow spontaneity and the overhearings. Everything's much more planned, and that's eating up time. Final one, if we can do. So quick plug, so we're running a study at the moment with other colleagues, Helen included, at Leeds, engineers, information systems colleagues, looking at what adaptations have been made to office space already to make them COVID safe. What can we learn from that in case we have to go back into this in the future? But also, what are the different options and approaches to making offices more hybrid supporting? and actually responding to employee trends at the moment. And also, can we start to get really good empirical measurements of what the implications of different designs and working patterns mean for things like knowledge sharing, friendship groups, productivity, where and how people work. There's a whole series of activities we're doing. We'd love it if people want to get involved in that as a company, or if you've got an individual story to tell. And our contact details are on this final slide. If you'd like to get in touch, or visit the webpage. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, guys. That's brilliant. And of course, the slides, well, the whole presentation will be shared as a recording, so those contact details will be available after the event. Thank you very much for that, Afshan, Matt and Helen. Our next speaker is Hannah Nardini, and I'll hand over the screen to you, Hannah, and the audience is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hopefully you can see my screen up there. So my role, I'm the founder of WK Space, and the work that we do is very much built around three key areas, and that is workplace strategy. So it's all of the consultancy and analytics that go with workplace, design, and then behavioural change management. We have a very particular focus around psychology. So obviously we were quite interested when everything changed last year to understand actually what does this mean for our business, because we need people to be in a workplace, to be workplace consultants. So we actually embarked upon our own independent research to try and identify actually what does this mean. And we started it off really as a point of interest. It just got traction. So you can see that as of last week, we've ended up with about 421,000 survey responses. We send out surveys on a weekly basis, and we've been tracking the changes that exist, not just within the UK, but also within the global workforce. There's about 7,500 responses a week that are allowing us to track. In addition to that, not only are we working in multiple cities and countries around the world, since May of 2020, we've actually had 144 clients that have engaged us to really start to answer the questions around what does the future world of work look like. And that means that we've engaged with over 72,000 employees. So the data I'm going to share with you today has been based upon real examples really of clients that we're working with and how this conversation is going. So let's make a start. So as far as the process itself, ordinarily, we would have tended to have looked at it from three particular facets pre-COVID. We would have looked at a leadership, which was a very high aspirational vision of workplace and how things they sort of perhaps aspirations and how they thought it might play out. We would then have an employee view, which is very much where our surveys would come from. So asking people a series of questions around what their thoughts and beliefs are. But we do know that that gives us an incredibly biased view. People tend to look at it mostly from their own lens, and we've noticed this more acutely, particularly during the pandemic. So we need to step away from that and step back. So whilst an individual may feel, well, actually, yes, I do enjoy working remotely and I would prefer to do that, we need to step back and think, actually, is that right for the team? Is that right for the business? Is that right for the clients? And to do that, we then look at manager engagement as well. So making sure that we understand, well, what has the impact actually been when we start to look at the collective? We do need to consider the new starters, the people who've never visited the office. They've never really truly met people in person. So they've had a whole different experience, and what's that been for them? And then finally, we're also looking at quite a lot of client engagement. So a lot of companies are giving us access to, say, their top 5 or top 10 clients, and we've got the opportunity to engage with them. What has their experiences been engaging with this company over the past 12 months, and how do they see that playing out in future? How might that change, and how does actually that business need to change to support that? So we are looking at this in a very multifaceted way. As far as some key trends that we've noticed, and what I'm going to be sharing with you today is mostly around key trends. We are seeing businesses, and obviously the people who employ us are keen to do the wider engagement. It's about making decisions that aren't just from one perspective of maybe the leadership view. It is about engaging and understanding a little bit more of the complexities that go with the wider organisation. What started off early on in the pandemic around short-term planning, it was typically 5-year leases with a favoured positioning point. We've actually found quite a lot of clients over the past 3 months have started to engage with 15-year leases, and we've seen a bit of a U-turn on that, but with 5-year breaks. So they're planning a lot more flexibility into it, but they are looking at cost and making sure that they can secure some of more sort of advantageous rates in the short term. But as far as kind of knowing that we are in uncertain times, and it is hard to predict what happens next because nobody quite knows, but there's a number of things that we can do to look at this as far as predictors, to understanding the personas that are in the workplace will help us do that. But actually, this is about proactive decision making. This is about organizations coming together and saying, actually, what do we want it to be? And using that as a mechanism to drive the change forward and actually make decisions, even though we are in this very uncertain time. And it's therefore about supporting people through that change to make sure that we can achieve the objectives that are set out. So in essence, what have we learned? It's very supportive of the presentation that we've just heard, but remote working, it did work. It has been effective and performance has been maintained. But we have noted the cracks appearing and a lot of our clients are feeling that too. Generally, it's felt that the current model or the current way of doing this is just simply not going to be sustainable. We've also noticed that the differences between the worker profiles has become quite profound. So not only is that the generational groups that we just learned about, it's the personality differences. It's those who are slightly more introverted and those who are more extroverted, and how this chasm starting to appear between them, but also around their planned expectations in future. We're also seeing the differences between managers and employees, and maybe slightly different views emerging there. But if we just look at some of the cracks that we've seen, and in addition to some that were already just previously mentioned, it has become a little bit untenable. People have absorbed their commute, they're working longer hours, and therefore in turn, productivity, absolutely rightly as was mentioned, well, you will be slightly more productive if you're working more hours, but if we actually look at that in a more reasonable sense, actually it isn't sustainable. People are burning out. We've done a lot of work around the perceived stress scale scoring and noticed that stress is rapidly increasing, particularly amongst the younger of the generations. We see that workload increase, particularly for colleagues where maybe they had team members who were furloughed and people were having to absorb additional work, and that's kind of stuck. That all of a sudden they were able to do it. And there's a little bit of a manager expectation that, well, you did it before, you can kind of continue doing that. And in turn, what we're seeing is a little bit of a fractious relationship appearing between colleagues. We're seeing that patience is just starting to wear a little bit thin. People are frustrated. We're noticing a lot more conflict coming through our engagement. So some of the internal bonds and that social capital that gets built by being in person is starting to break down ever so slightly. We are also picking up on that osmosis learning, the professional development, particularly of junior or younger colleagues who maybe feel that they're going to be at a disadvantage in a few years' time when maybe there's a bit of a skills gap emerging. Are they going to get the same promotional opportunities that they might have had this pandemic have not happened? So there's a number of different issues emerging, and we've also noted with client relationships an interesting facet here that they also are perceived to have weakened, but particularly in reference to new relationships. So it's generally felt that a client relationship that you had pre-pandemic has got stronger. Turning that into a virtual mechanism has actually been quite successful, to the point where people generally report they get more time with that client. So they feel that the bond, and they've gone through this whole thing together and they've learnt together, that's been okay. But new relationships where people aren't getting that face-to-face connection generally are felt to be weaker. The view is that the loyalty is not there, it's not built in quite the same way. Having tested this out, and we've done this in a number of law firms where relationships are quite critical, it's noted that people feel about 3 in-person meetings are required to build that relationship sufficiently to support moving that into a more virtual mechanism. So we are likely to see the return of face-to-face meetings, and we've noticed ourselves much more demand for clients to ask us to come in and meet in person. But we do know that virtual meetings are here to stay. We will see a general acceptance of virtual meetings, and perhaps the pushback of people saying, I don't want to do that commute for 3 hours just for the sake of a 1-hour meeting. So reflecting on what might be in future, asking people, and it is quite an aspirational question, what do you think your preferred working pattern might be? And this is typically where it's leveled down. I'll be honest, we measure this on a weekly basis, compare it against our own client data. It is not moving very far. So we do feel that this is somewhat stabilised. But in the early days of the pandemic, we saw about 30% of people saying that they would prefer to be pure remote workers. We've now settled out at about 5%. Equally, we've only got about somewhere generally hovers between 2 and 5% of people saying that they want to be in the office full time. Those days of in the office full time maybe have gone. People are looking for balance, and this is typically somewhere between 2 and 3 days in the office or with a flexible schedule. And when we calculate this out broadly into what could your day-to-day occupation be, it could be about 39%. But when we ask managers the same question, what do you think might happen with the way your team is working, we start to notice the differences. We start to see managers more in focus perhaps of office attendance. We are seeing in some organisations a little bit of a return to presenteeism, the feeling that they just need to see people, or maybe the performance isn't as good and we need to have people back. Now, we typically would say that's a whole different issue that needs to be managed with separately. It's not about pulling people back into the physical space, but this is where we are seeing some of those differences appear. I'll skip past this because I know we've just touched on that. So let's focus a little bit on the office and why people are going to come in. Let's think a little bit about the trends that are emerging. And this is a quote that's resonated with us. People saying, what's the point? And what's the point of doing that commute to leave a desk that is in my home office, to drive to an office or catch a train to an office and just sit at another desk? It doesn't seem like that's going to be one of the key motivators. So the reasons that we've noted, and there are top 5 reasons, consistently come out in every survey. The need to socialise, just to reconnect with other people. It's to collaboratively work with colleagues. It's project-focused working. To just mix it up, and that's particularly noted by some of the younger of the generations. To attend the client meetings, again, I gave you the stats relating to the client relationships, but also just to feel a sense of community. Some people describe being in a large organisation as feeling like they're in this one-man company. It's the ability to feel like you're a part of something bigger. So these are potentially some of the drivers, but if we look at the long term before we reflect on the short term, what we're seeing as a typical trend is one of 2 things. It's around space rationalization. It could be about having multiple offices. Do we need that much duplication? Could we be doing things smarter? We are finding the typical go-to figure is about a 30% space reduction. The alternate way of looking at that is actually, as an organisation, we are rapidly growing, but we don't want to take more space. So how do we use our existing space and accommodate additional growth into that particular space? Now, it typically will fall into one of those 2 categories. We are seeing activity-based working adoption now much more fast-tracked. It is not a new concept. It has been around for many years, at least 14 to 20 years in its making. But we are seeing that maybe the organisations that were risk averse to it pre-COVID have now actually de-risked it. We can do it. We can do this in a different way, and are actually going out and making those proactive decisions. But we are seeing a lot more connected strategies as far as multiple locations, looking at it in one go. Let's look at our entire portfolio and what this could potentially mean. So I'm just going to very briefly share with you the top 5 trends that we are noticing. The first one is around the immediate short term. So what a lot of organisations are doing is looking at what that long-term picture looks like, and then we pare it back and we start to think about how do we make best use of this return to make sure that we're aligning where we want to go strategically. We are seeing somewhere between September and November as the go-to. It started off as September, actually quite a few months ago. September seems to be a time we all sort of associate with things opening up and schools go back. So there's a lot of kind of association with September. We have noticed in the past 2 weeks, November has now started to creep in. The general view, though, is things will not really return to any form of perhaps regularity until at least January of next year. So a lot of people are looking at this in a 2-phase approach. We're also seeing some of the challenges about not having people in the space at the same time. People are getting over that by scheduling team days. We're hearing a lot of conversation about away days in the office. But that idea of making it something that's like an event or something that's quite exciting to be invited to, but making it different. It's not just a case of coming in and sitting behind a desk. It's actually about a different type of interaction when you are in that particular environment. As far as remote working frameworks, we've been working with clients to create quite a few of these over the past few months. We are seeing structure. come through. A lot of organisations are now realising that the differences between these worker profiles is becoming actually quite vast. How do we pull this back together without creating perhaps more of a cultural rift? So what we are seeing come into play is structural frameworks. There's a term that a lot of people are talking about, which is freedom within the framework. So let's create the boundaries of what we're expecting as a workplace, but give people still that element of flexibility and autonomy. But what we're not seeing is team-led approaches. This is about a universal framework. Managers are therefore being coached to make sure it's applied in a very consistent and fair way. But the typical way that we're seeing this go is less about days in the office and more about percentage of time. So somewhere between 40 and 60% appears, to be honest, with our clients where it seems to be settling. But appreciating that some weeks you might be in a lot more and the next week you might not be in at all. It's building in, again, another layer of inherent flexibility that could potentially go with that. But even with 40 to 60% office occupation, still gives us an immense opportunity with regards to the workplace. So the third trend we're seeing is around behaviour shifts. There's been a lot of talk around cutting the plugs off the printers, so let's get rid of at least 50%. You've not used them. In fact, only 6% of people have reported missing them. People have coped without it. And in fact, when we look at storage, some people reported taking suitcases of files home with them and they've never actually opened them. People have been forced to rely on cloud-based storage systems. So it's well within the capability to look at storage reduction of at least 70%. And this is something that can happen now before you even plan that re-entry back in. If people come back and start to fall into that habit, it will be quite difficult, to break that. So people are starting to think about these long-term behaviour shifts. It is about some of the habits around activity-based working, so therefore looking at shared space, clear desk policies. Obviously, that's practical from a COVID maintenance perspective. We're seeing behavioural contracts come into play. So expectations of what you do and your behaviour impacts on your nearest neighbours, and what are you doing to actually take care of not just yourself, but also the needs of other people. So we're seeing employers starting to push back a little bit on individuals to say, actually, we've given you the tools, it's up to you to now and go and make good use of them. We're also seeing a lot of conversation around protocols and practices, particularly relating to hybrid meetings. How do we make that an equal experience when you've got some people who are there in person and some people who are dialing in? So setting out expectations or guidelines or toolkits, we're seeing, around how these meetings should perhaps operate in future. So the workplace changes. We're seeing piloting. If you are an organisation where you're not quite yet at a lease event and you feel a bit stuck, then test things out. You've got this golden opportunity to try and experiment and experience different things, learn from it, gather data, make informed decisions based upon that. But we're also starting to have some brave conversations. There's some models appearing around rotational working. It's layered models. It's not particularly a new concept, but hasn't really been embraced by many organisations. But the principles of certain teams get certain days and you rotate, and this means that you can save about sort of 4 to 3/5 of your space, so you can operate in a very condensed model. We are now as well starting to talk about the deskless office. For lots of reasons, but primarily the reasons of why people will come into the office. But are you really going to want to come in and just sit behind the desk? It's often been quite a talked about concept with open plan. We are starting to see the complaints about it massively amplify. So we are talking in some instances to law firms who are thinking about big restaurants and cafes. They supply food and drink all through the day and you can just drop in and out. It's a 24-hour operation. So maybe you just fit in work that suits with your personal schedule. These are the types of conversations that are now being had. But a lot of emphasis on well-being, particularly noting that physical and mental well-being has suffered. So we're seeing the rise of things like Peloton bikes in rooms that you can go to, yoga or stretching studios, reflection and meditation space, parents' rooms, winter gardens and counselling rooms, rooms that you can go into and speak to a virtual counsellor immediately. There's a greater emphasis now on well-being more than ever. So it's a great opportunity to perhaps embrace some of those opportunities. And then finally, we start to look at technology. It's massively taken centre stage. So previously, we would have said that desk booking apps actually probably weren't worth going for. People, once they got comfortable and confident that there was a space would not tend to use them. But we're now seeing that this is part of inherent planning that people are looking for. So planning ahead, knowing that they've got a space booked if they are making that commute into the office. But we're seeing it become more building intelligence. So looking at lifestyle. So at what time should I set off? What's the traffic doing? Can I pre-book my cycle space? How busy are the showers right now? All the way through to what's the best time to go and get lunch because I don't want to queue too long. We're seeing this type of digital integration now come into the workplace, tapping into IoT sensors to capture live real-time data. And that's allowing people to select spaces based upon the noise level, the light level, the air quality, or even just around finding their colleagues. So it started to push more control to the individual. We are seeing more collaborative tools. We've got a lot of organizations that previously would have done sprints and scrums using whiteboarding say actually they'll never go back to doing that in person. They're starting to use more Miro boards to perhaps connect globally in a different way. But we're also seeing even training of technology become much more of a virtual mechanism with people reporting that it's been particularly successful. So my final slide, if I'm going to give you any trends of what's going up and what's going down. Going up, hybrid working models. Without a doubt, it is fast tracking towards activity-based working more than ever. It is looking at shared space and actually optimizing the environments themselves. It is about being strategic. This isn't about just planning for the short term. This is about thinking what the next 5, 10, and 15 years could potentially look like. We don't want to be wasteful with resources. There's no point doing something on a short term that potentially you're just going to knock down and rebuild every few years. That's incredibly wasteful. So just think about it and let's think about the bigger picture first. As far as what's going down, I'm glad to say is sneeze screens and Perspex panels, which I'm glad that none of our clients actually embarked upon purchasing. Definitely disappeared, but we're not really seeing the full-time return to the office. I know there are some organisations have come out and said they're encouraging that. Interestingly though, recent research suggests that they're also the ones with employees at the highest rates going to recruitment agents. So proceed at your peril potentially on that one. But open plan, it's long been the bane of people's lives. We are seeing perhaps less open plan working in favour of more control over the individual environment. And then finally, just around other considerations, printing, paper and storage, we're seeing much more emphasis on being sustainable. People have started to think green. This is a perfect opportunity to perhaps plan that on your return. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Hannah, very much indeed. That's very interesting. And it's very interesting that you say the highest rate of returning to the office is amongst recruitment companies. Not, I should say, at 4IT. But then we're learning from events like these. Our next speaker is Mark Bland. Mark, are you there?
Yes, I am. Sorry, just come off mute.
Fantastic. You're very nearly giving me the heebie-jeebies. I'll pass the baton to you. Mark's going to talk about COVID-19 disruptor or eye-opener. Thank you, Mark. Can't yet see you.
Can you see my screen?
I can see your screen. I can't see you.
There we go. I think we turned my camera off. There we go.
There we are. Thank you, Mark.
So, two great presentations there. Thank you for that. I'm gonna have to admit that's quite a lot of that stuff is going to be covered in mine too. So where to start? I think for me, I want to talk about how COVID-19 for me has been a level of the playing field for in a lot of ways across our organisation. I'm going to talk about a lot of the same stuff that the two previous discussions have covered. So I probably will reference Afshan, Helen and Matt and Hannah's work as I go through this as well. But before we start, let's start with about me. So I manage the testing team at Premier Farnell. I've been at Farnell for 20 years now, which is unusual in my industry, but I've had a lot of opportunities there to move within the organisation. I felt it important to show you these 4 pictures because that's kind of a transition of me through COVID. We all experienced the horribleness of not being able to go to a barber's during COVID, and I embraced it, I think, is what I'm showing you here. Let myself go a little bit mad with it there, but I am back to normal now, as you can see. During my time at Farnell, I've managed lots of teams within the testing department, and a lot of that time I've had remote teams. whether they be permanent team members or augmented workforces from third parties. I've worked with the remote teams quite a lot. So my talk is going to start off by looking at how, for me, COVID-19 leveled the playing field between remote workforces and the in-office workforce. And it's going to talk to a lot of the points that the previous talkers have listed. So before COVID, okay, my offshore workforces, be the permanent team in America or my India teams or teams in Singapore and Australia, would generally complain that they felt like they were on the outside of the circle. They very much felt like a lot of decisions were made around the water cooler conversations that Helen mentioned previously, and I believe Hannah mentioned as well, around those water cooler conversations, and they were missing out on that. They were missing out on that interaction, and they felt like they were always second in to know what was going on within the projects, and an afterthought in terms of communication. And this was something that initially I thought, well, maybe that's just a perception thing, and then I looked at ways to make that better, introducing tools and such to improve that communication. But generally, when I found myself in India working with the teams, or in Chicago working with the teams, I found that they were right. That was actually the case. And it's very difficult as an organization, when the core of your organization is in one location, to make sure that all of the conversations and all of the communications you have while you're sat in an office together propagate out and get to the right people. For me, when COVID hit, whilst there are so many horrible ramifications of what happened during that pandemic, there were a lot of really positive changes that I saw in our environment. I will say off the bat, I fully recognize all of the negative things and all of the challenges that Hannah, Matt, Helen, and Afshan have highlighted about working remotely, and I absolutely accept them. But this is more about my perception of the positive things, and I want to focus on the positive things that I think we achieved. So what I noticed straight away was that every single person in our organization was now experiencing the isolation that our offshore teams had felt up to this point. It was an eye-opener. It was an eye-opener for me, and I was already aware of this challenge from spending time with those teams. But it was a real eye-opener for, I think, the whole project teams as to how difficult it is to stay up to date with a project and to stay on track with your project and your workload when you're actually only getting bits and bats of information. And I think one of the things that's changed as a result of that within our organization, definitely, and I'm sure within other organizations from talking to people, is that we've learned how to communicate better. And I know Hannah called out that the stats are saying that communication is still failing. I think there will always be challenges with it. But for me, we learned how to be more inclusive as a result of all being isolated. It was interesting to see how people changed and started sharing, and the communication changed in terms of emails and messaging and other applications, which we'll get onto in a moment, which obviously we all took up to try and manage this pandemic. But for me, it put everybody in the same boat, and putting everybody in the same boat meant people were more inclined then to make an effort to overcome this challenge. Obviously, we had to overcome this challenge. We had to maintain our workload, and we had to continue the projects and try to, as organizations, survive in this completely new and unknown landscape. So I think immediately from remote workforces, you had an improvement in the way that they were communicated to and communicated with. On communication, so we lost those water cooler conversations. There's no more of that walking past someone's desk and saying, you know, have you got 5 minutes for a quick chat? Or as I believe Helen mentioned, just passing somebody and saying, oh, that conversation, is that about this? Because I've got some input into that. All of that got lost. So what that meant was we had to find new ways to deal with that. We had to find new ways to get that information across and to make sure that our requirements were understood, which meant, one, we got better at using the tools that we had to communicate, but two, we got better at being more succinct in that communication. And I think you realize very quickly, if the only way you're communicating is digitally, if you don't get the context of that communication right, your project fails. You find yourself behind the curveball, dodging a curveball, sorry, or behind the line where you need to be at. So people started catering the conversations and the communications between teams a lot better. There were still negatives. There are lots of negatives to call on with communication, where I think we can still make a lot of improvement. But again, I saw a massive improvement in the way that people communicated digitally with one another. Now, one thing that did happen when this pandemic hit was conversations became emails, emails became meetings, and meetings became longer, multiple meetings. I personally, as a manager, found myself with a calendar like I have never seen before, which essentially had overlapping meetings in every hour of the day, and I had to choose which of those meetings to attend and which ones had the most priority, sometimes swapping from day to day between meetings. But for the teams, I think what it meant we had to do was we had to start observing meeting culture a lot better. Meeting culture is always a problem in organizations. I think all organizations, but certainly IT organizations and project-driven organizations, meeting culture very quickly gets out of control. I've literally sat in meetings to plan the content for a meeting, which is utterly ridiculous. I've also sat in lots and lots and lots of meetings over the years which have had no outcome, which have had no minutes or no expectations at the end of the meeting, and have essentially been a conversation I could have lived without. So I think one of the things that we had to start doing very quickly was being careful about who you invite to meetings, not in terms of trying to isolate people, but in terms of not wasting people's time. You don't invite a person to a meeting if you're only going to look to them right at the end of that meeting and say, have you got any concerns? Because that's just, it's frustrating and it's pointless, and it wastes a lot of people's time. So people started following meeting etiquette a lot better. All meeting invites started coming to us with agendas, with a clear list of what was going to be discussed, and with that option for you to opt out of that meeting early on. I do still see meetings where you get invited just to give someone confidence that you're there, but it's less, and you've got the option now to choose which ones you do and don't attend. So I think I've seen a lot of positives in that regard as well. One of the other things I think has been real positive about the tooling that we've used and the take-up of tooling is the comedy value that's come from having video conferencing all the time. We're not used to it. We're not generally used to being in front of cameras. We're not used to essentially performing, and we very quickly forget that there's cameras on. And I think it's added a bit of levity to what has been otherwise a very stressful and psychologically jarring experience of being trapped, of being, if anybody was like me, 12 weeks in isolation in that first pandemic, you know, and having that levity, that those little mistakes that people make, the constant talking on mute, and that for me has made some of that meeting culture a lot easier to deal with. It's given people permission to relax a little bit and not necessarily be so strict and serious in what they're doing every single minute of the day. And I think you need that. I think for me, if you're going to be comfortable at work where you spend a heck of a lot of time, you need some levity. There needs to be some break from that we would get before by going for a coffee with an associate or stopping at someone's desk and having a bit of a chat and a bit of a conversation. When we lost that, we needed to get that back somehow. And for me, the comedy moments on meetings have been one of the things that have got me through a lot of the meetings and the meeting culture within the pandemic, and the necessity to use teams and tools of that nature. So on to tools and technology. I think one of the real benefits for me that's been driven by this situation is the uptake of tools and the consistent use of tools between teams and between organizations. I think, unfortunately, there may be some smaller companies who develop tools that have lost out in this race, but I think it's probably safe to say that companies like Microsoft with Teams, like Zoom, like GoToMeet, have probably increased their profits significantly over the last year, because we were put in a situation where we had to find a way to link all of our organizations together and all of our teams together in a way that we've never had to do before, or at least we've not had to do for the entire organization. And that meant that you very quickly whittled down to a core selection of tools that pretty much everybody used, which meant you got a lot quicker take up, a lot more familiar with the tools that you were using on a day-to-day basis to communicate with people, and you didn't spend as much time at the beginning of each meeting ambling through buttons and preferences and trying to get things set up, although it does still happen, as we saw with my mute button at the start there. But yeah, we took on tools and we took them on in a way that we never have before. So when this pandemic started last March, we had literally just, at my organization, we just introduced Microsoft Teams. And I think it was 2 weeks before I got my sign in for Microsoft Teams, before the pandemic and the quarantine started, the first lockdown started. And in all my time, in my 20 years at Fano, we've introduced a lot of tools. We've introduced a lot of communication tools and a lot of share spaces and collaboration tools. And I have never in my time seen a tool taken up so quickly with so little resistance to change. And I think one of the things that really stood out with the situation was, yeah, it was a terrible situation. We had to get over it. But what that did is it took away that fear that people have of taking on a new tool. Because it is fear when we introduce a new tool into an organization, people see it as questioning their way of working and their comfort around what it is that they do, and they reject it. So it would have taken us easily a year, if not a year and a half, to roll out Teams. And I can almost guarantee you still wouldn't have got 100% of your workforce using it by that time. As it stood, it took us 2 weeks. 2 weeks to roll out a tool across an organization with 7,000 people in it. And that was just the Farnell part. If you look at our parent company, Avnet, there are 20, 30,000 people in the organization, and Teams was rolled out very quickly across that entire organization to cope with this pandemic, which you've got to take a positive from that. You've got to look at that as a real achievement for any company to be able to roll out and get up and running with a tool that quickly. Yeah, generally, I think I was very impressed with that, and I found that to be one of the biggest successes and one of the biggest positives to come out of the situation we were in. Innovation. So our need will be the real creator. That's what Plato said. It got changed. I'm sure he said it in that Yorkshire accent as well, in very broken Yorkshire English. But that's what Plato said, and it got changed very quickly to necessity is the mother of invention. I believe that's the proverb more people will be familiar with, and it is. It absolutely is. One of the things that occurred when this pandemic occurred was that we were all thrown very quickly into a situation that we weren't comfortable with, and we were trying to maintain business as usual. We were trying to continue our projects, and we were trying to continue growth and all the things that companies want to do in the face of this huge challenge. Working remotely, first of all, everybody working remotely and taking on this new way of communicating and taking on this new way of working, but also just psychologically having to do all of your tasks that you would normally, I don't know, maybe occasionally lean on a person to help you out with, just have a quick chat to get some assistance with something. All of those options disappeared overnight. Every single one of those options disappeared overnight, and we had to come up with new and inventive ways to do our daily work, to do what had been just second nature and mundane to us up to that point. And I think as a result of that, and not necessarily in terms of technology, but as a result of that, behaviors, innovation in behavior and innovation in the way that teams interacted with each other, for me, was absolutely off the scale at our organization when this all began. It's continued throughout as we've taken on new projects and come across new challenges, as every organization has. The innovation to deal with problems has just continued to come out of nowhere. And the beauty of it for me is that the innovation hasn't been driven by managers, and it hasn't been driven by the technical experts or the technical leaders. It's been anybody who's needed to achieve something. We've had some of the best suggestions we've had in terms of how we operate and how we run projects have come from testers or a BA or a low-level dev, or even just one of the manager's PAs has made a suggestion that's made all of our lives easier. And I think that's a beautiful to see in any environment, but especially in an environment where normally there would be a hierarchy for that kind of thing. There would be an expectation that you'd go to an expert to look at how to fix this, or a manager would be expected to drive that. I think to be in a position where you can share that responsibility, and where people can step up and people can show that they're not just a member of the team, but they've actually got something more to offer. You know, they want to offer more. They want to be more involved. I think that's a real positive to take away from a situation like that. So adversity brings out the best in us. It really does. And I think one of the other real challenging things about any kind of situation like this, be it a war, a pandemic, any natural disaster, is that there will be people who struggle. There will be people who are in a lot more peril than others and a lot more stress than others. And the teams have come together, and people have come together in a way that they wouldn't necessarily have done if we were in the office. You know, in the office, it's very easy to see somebody who's in distress and let the person who's immediately next to them deal with that, and kind of think to yourself, I've got to crack on and do this, do my stuff. You know, I ain't got time to help with that. Now, I would hope as a manager and with other managers that wouldn't be the case, that if you see someone in distress, you will reach out and help. But we know that when you're in a situation where there's lots of other people around, we will often defer to the other people and let other people do that. We'll hold back and wait until other people pick that up. I think the situation we've had here, where what would normally be a quick conversation with someone is now a Teams meeting or a video conference. You've been exposed a lot more to seeing that challenging people, that stress that people are going through, and it's become the norm now to ask somebody, you know, if you're all right, you know, is there anything I can do to help? And I think that's something we've been trying to do for a long time in terms of supporting people, is get people just to say, are you okay? Are you doing all right? So I think that for me is another way in which we've really moved forward. We're united under a common goal, basically, and we have all realized we're in this mess together. One of the other key innovation points for me, and it's not so much an innovation, it's as a thing we don't often get to do, is any big organization like mine, like the ones that you guys work for, will have what are referred to as business continuity plans. But it's not something that you ever get to test, not properly. And I think this situation, as a test manager, this situation for me highlighted a lot of areas where we weren't so tight, but highlighted that the business continuity plans that we've talked about for years and we've put in place actually do work. And when push comes to shove, it wasn't a building burning down as you plan for any business continuity, or a train crashing or something like that, which tend to be the common paradigms you work around. It was something completely unexpected that we could never have guessed at. It was a global pandemic that meant after a news update on a Thursday, we all had to shut down the office and work completely remotely from the following Monday. That's a level of business continuity testing that I could never have hoped to achieve in a normal runtime environment, in a normal work day working in the office. I couldn't have got permission to push everybody out remote and see if those situations work. So to see those business continuity plans actually put in action and working, it was a real inspiring sight. It was an inspiring experience. And to see how quickly IT teams turned around hundreds and hundreds of laptops set up to make sure sales teams could work remotely, because all those teams have desktops in our office, or did. You know, to be able to do that in a weekend, the effort that went into that was epic. But we made it work. We successfully transitioned from almost completely in office working to completely out of office working in a weekend, which was just phenomenal. I think I mentioned it a little bit before. Empathy and understanding has been another real positive for me from this pandemic. And I know Hannah talked about how people are starting to revert from that now, and relationships are getting a little bit more fraught now. But but I think one of the real big things that I took early on in this pandemic, and I still see now, even though I absolutely agree, it is getting much more difficult psychologically to completely be remote all the time and relying on people to send emails on time and do stuff. But one of the things I really saw and thought was fantastic was the way that you started to look at your colleagues. I've worked with people in Farnell for 10 years and never really once knew anything about the family or talked to them about the family or the hobbies or stuff like that. And it wasn't because I didn't like those people. It was just we didn't interact in that way. There was no reason to interact in that way. We met for projects, we did stuff, and then we moved on. We all had busy jobs, so we didn't take that time to interact and to get to know each other. But through this pandemic, you've had people homeschooling, you've had people working out of their own homes, and after a couple of weeks, maybe the first month, people started to really relax about how much of themselves and their real life they were showing, and they were happy to show. You know, we kept up a facade of being professional and wearing shirt and tie for things on the camera for the first couple of weeks, but eventually you relax. You have to relax and become more comfortable with it. And we got a window into people's lives that we would never otherwise have got. And I think it gives you much bigger appreciation for the challenges that people are facing, for the hardships outside of work that are sometimes maybe causing the delays to things that you're expecting from them in work, which is incredible, you know, to be able to empathize, which we should be trying to do anyway, but to be able to empathize at that level with your workmates means you're much more accepting of delays. You're much more accepting of things not necessarily going exactly as you'd planned, and you again look to help each other through that. You see the challenges, and you're more inclined to want to be supportive of that. That's a beautiful thing. We've all got challenges in our lives. We've all got things going on that we don't bring to work. We tend to hide. We tend to keep that to ourselves, and we tell ourselves it doesn't affect us. But the reality of it is it does. If you've got something going on in your life that's a psychological burden, there is no way you can keep that from affecting your work. But in the past, you've been able to at least just not talk about it and ignore it. Whereas now, I think having this window into each other's lives with the cameras has made it all a lot more obvious, and it's exposed a lot more of that and made us have to look at our colleagues as people, as human beings. I think this for me is probably the number one gain we've had as a result of this pandemic. The organizations, individuals, governments are really now pushing the idea of mental health awareness. Anybody who's ever worked with or done any work for a mental health charity knows how difficult it is just to get awareness out there, just to get people to consider the impact of work stresses, of life stresses, of what's going on, just to get people feeling comfortable enough to say, I'm stressed, I'm actually really stressed and I could do with some help. The global push on mental health awareness and people trying to get a work-life balance to look after their own health as well as considering other people's health has been phenomenal. And I hope and I pray that this is not something that regresses when we do start getting back to the office, because I think the level of awareness we've got now is fantastic, but it's a good starting place. We need to keep pushing and keep moving forward with mental health awareness and work-life balance awareness and appreciation to ensure that the people that work with us, they're not resources, the people that work with us are healthy, are well, because healthy people who are well within themselves and people who aren't completely stressed every moment of the day are more productive people. It's not rocket science. If you want your team to be as efficient as they can be, then what you can't do is put them under stress. What you shouldn't be doing is putting them under stress and ignoring the challenges that are going on in the world. So for me, mental health awareness and recognition that work-life balance is something that really needs to be considered individually and as a manager for my team and as an organization for all of its employees, that's a win. That for me is a huge goal achieved, and something that we absolutely have to continue forward when we move past this pandemic. And that brings me to the end. My closing thought is, how do we avoid slipping back into old ways? How do we carry the lessons forward with us? Hannah had some good feedback in terms of stats, and I think Matt, Helen, and Afshan had some great ideas about how we can look to structure our workplace when we get back and these things. So, you know, I think the key now is making sure when we go back, we keep all these wins, all these positives that we have gained in amongst all those negatives. We make sure that they're part of our everyday life and they're part of the culture we push forwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for that presentation. That's wonderful. And our final two speakers are Ali and Jamie. Ali, am I giving the screen to you?
Yes.
Do that now. Thank you very much, Mark. We'll come back after this final presentation for the Q&A. Keep the questions coming in, do please. We'll have time to cover certainly a few of them. Ali, the screen is yours.
Okay. Okay, you have to shout when you can see it in a second. Sorry. Technical glitch on it. Okay. Can you see that?
That's perfect. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, you ready, Jamie?
Yeah, ready. So good afternoon, everyone. Obviously, I'm conscious it's sunny and we're all stuck inside, and obviously a couple hours in, so we'll try and keep this as short and concise as we can. But really, what we want to share with you today, and we'll go on to intros in a moment, is actually a little bit good news, I guess, in terms of COVID. So this isn't to say that COVID's been a good thing and, you know, we're glad it's happened, but this is really to share our story in terms of how it's actually been a positive force for change in our community of practice. And when we say community of practice, what I mean by that is our business analyst community of practice within the Department of Work and Pensions digital side. And that's made up of 300 people spread before COVID over 6 hubs, so 6 digital hubs around the UK. Obviously during COVID, over 300 different homes, kitchen tables, spare bedrooms, and everything else. So that's what we're here to do today, to share with you. Let's go to the next slide, Ali. So my name is Jamie Toyne. I'm head of business analysis, was at DWP Digital, where the story is. I've very, very recently, in the last few weeks, moved to the Ministry of Justice, but this is very much around DWP in particular. Ali, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Ali Yarovsky. I'm one of the lead BAs at the Department of Work and Pensions within the digital space. I'm one of the practice leads, so working on anything practice related, such as recruitment, staff development, apprenticeships, all that kind of stuff.
So this is me, isn't
me.
it?
Yeah. I'm just changing lots of slides at once. So as Jamie's mentioned, we've got a really large community within DWP Digital. So between 250, 300 BAs spread across 6 different hub locations. So really geographically spread throughout the UK. Our events tended to be pre-COVID run at local levels. So we tended to run very location specific events, share and learns. And that was really mainly because we tended to have them face to face. That was just the way we've always tended to do things. We'll book a big room, get everyone round, run a lunch and learn or some other kind of event. And also the technology wasn't necessarily there to link up different hubs with each other. So it was quite difficult to kind of work in that way. So it did mean that we often duplicated events. So I might be running an event for some of our BAs in Newcastle, might have a colleague running something very similar in Sheffield or Leeds, and there wasn't a lot of crossover. Okay, so working in that way did mean that we felt like we gave people probably a pretty two-tier kind of experience. So our hubs tended to have different levels of maturity depending on which location you're in and which people were based in those hubs. So some hubs had a number of leads or senior BAs, others didn't. So actually the kind of things that were covered in some of our share and learns and community events could be quite different. We tended to have less cross-hub community activity. So as I mentioned before, it was often just because we're based in different offices, and kind of meeting up would mean traveling or trying to book really large meeting rooms, and the technology often let us down. So because of the way we were working, we weren't taking advantage of our scale and our diversity. So, you know, talking about a group of 250 plus 300 BAs, we've got a lot of diversity and a lot of knowledge in that area, and we weren't really kind of sharing that amongst all the different hub locations. We were tending to be very sort of location specific. So it just meant sometimes the areas of expertise were really kind of limited to the hub in which the person who had that expertise was based. Okay. This beautiful picture kind of explains what happened in March 2020. So March 2020, mass exodus from the office. Everyone forced to kind of set up some sort of home office, whether that be kitchen table, living room, surrounded by kids, dogs, and the obligatory Amazon delivery interruptions throughout your Teams meetings. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. So what was our immediate response? Well, obviously, other than trying to deal with homeschooling kids, dealing with very clingy dogs and cats, trying to find a suitable chair, and constantly going to the door to get the latest Amazon delivery or wine delivery, was obviously what can we do best to support people in our organisation and people in our profession as a community of practice. And I think as a leadership team, we made a conscious effort really to shift to be more pastorally focused as a community. And I think we tried to focus on community spirit more than anything else as much as possible. So we established things like social events, regular quiz, which was set up, which I think everyone else seemed to copy fairly quickly. And I think, if anything, people were getting fed up of quizzes after a few months into COVID. We tried a number of different things, which was a shift from being more profession orientated into pastoral sort of focus. And similarly, along with that, we set up a number of different keeping in touch sessions with people, both on a smaller group basis, and also then use established sort of technology channels for people to communicate outside of those. And the other thing we did is we made ourselves really visible as a leadership team. We wanted everyone in our community to know that if they wanted someone to chat to, someone to vent at, someone maybe just to help them get the right angle set up on Microsoft Teams or anything else, that they can get in contact with us, and we're happy to listen and be that sort of friendly face for someone to talk to. And I think the other thing that we did was focus on, okay, there's a huge amount of stuff going off, in terms of people's adapting to what COVID was and what it meant for them, both personally, not seeing friends and family, but also professionally, trying to work from home alongside juggle everything else that was going off at the same time. So we made the decision to pause a number of things, and recruitment is one of those that's mentioned on there. The reason we paused recruitment, for example, was one, we wanted to make sure people, when they're applying for vacancies, were going so in a space that would give them the best opportunity to succeed. And we thought there was just too much going off people to have another thing yet to think about in terms of applications, in terms of interviews, in terms of getting ready for what it can be quite a stressful process. And similarly, we needed to adapt how we recruited people. We needed to shift how we assessed people, interviewed people, from being office-based activities, using post-it notes and sticking stuff up and getting people's thoughts in that way, to something that was actually online with the technology and everything else to support. So we halted that. We halted other activities as well that probably potentially could have unsettled people and had a further disruption. Similarly, we looked at training. Now, I guess this was probably less conscious in many ways, but training stopped. So almost all of our training, like many organisations, obviously was either done in-house or majority was done using various external providers. And those providers, obviously, typically was centred around classroom learning. And obviously, when you can't get people into a building, as we all know, you can't get people onto a classroom-led course. And our providers, like many training providers, obviously weren't necessarily geared up to shifting all of their courses and all their material onto sort of virtual methods. So that all stopped. The other thing that stopped was inductions. So we were geared up as an organisation, but as a community as well, to induct people into their team. We work in agile, multidisciplinary teams. It's getting to know different people in the team doing different things, but also getting to know other business analysts in the community as well. So a lot of that stopped because the mechanism was very much go and spend some time with so-and-so, go and along to this particular ceremony, do this, do that. And actually it wasn't necessarily dependent on technology, it was dependent on getting to know people in an office environment, those corridor conversations, grabbing a coffee, nipping out for lunch, etc., etc. All the good stuff that I think we already know and others have covered earlier on. And the other thing was, as a community of practice, as a group of professional business analysts in the region of 300 across 6 hubs, as we've touched on before, we tended actually to have more hub-based communities. We didn't really have a cross-hub community in that way. So if you're in Manchester, you tended to really deal with the business analysts who were in Manchester. If you're in Blackpool, the same. If you're in Sheffield, the same. So obviously what that meant was once people couldn't go into an office, a lot of that tended to stop because there was no way to build networks, share knowledge and experience. So really a lot of our community stuff stopped, other than sort of the immediate sort of pastoral response. So obviously moving on from, I guess, the things that we did immediately, what did we sort of collate as a strategic response? So I think once we got into the rhythm of what COVID meant, what its impacts on working for home were, and I think also that we knew it was going to stay around for a little while, we spent time to define our strategy. And we wanted to do this in the most collaborative way possible. We've got a really big, but also diverse number of people in our profession, people who are new to business analysis, people who are new to working in digital environments, people who are new to working in government, as well as those that are more experienced in either working in the profession, in the organisation, or in a digital setting. What we also wanted to do was look at what worked well before. So before, we had a really active community, or set of 6 different communities really, but also we did lots of great stuff in terms of the delivery element of our roles too. And similarly, we wanted to look at what moving to a virtual community in a virtual world would allow us to do that maybe we couldn't do before. I think next one's me, yeah. So from that, we wanted to look at obviously a number of different things, but also at the same time, we wanted to acknowledge the world we're in. So being the Department of Work and Pensions brought lots and lots of challenges for us in our delivery elements of our roles. So as an organisation, we obviously deal with the most vulnerable in our society, as well as obviously a huge number of people that were falling into that category, or people that needed some kind of support due to the economic impact of COVID. So what that meant was obviously we as business analysts and digital professionals more than ever were in demand, and we had to get stuff out the door quicker, better, and with more people then consuming and using those services. So that could have been things like applying for a job, responding to various new government policies put in place at the time to help people and support them, or even just signposting people to what kind of things are even out there for them to consider. And this was whilst acknowledging one of our biggest channels, job centres, weren't fully operational. So digital became even more key. And what that did was obviously also put extra pressure on people in the community. We needed to obviously both deal with the change in our own personal lives, deal with the change in our professional lives, also then manage the change in our other family members' lives, that'd be children or even down to dogs in all seriousness, and cats and everything else. And actually, how can we put then both a responsive sort of network in place to support people, but also have that community as a way of sharing knowledge and experience in a really, really accessible way. And the other thing we did was we wanted to really learn from new hires that we brought on during those early few weeks. So what was it like during an organisation where you couldn't actually meet anyone face to face, where your only interaction with people was over Microsoft Teams or similar technology? And I think a lot of the things that came out in some of the presentations earlier were very much what we saw in our community. And we want to, obviously, like I say, we want us to learn from that and try to make it as welcoming as environment as possible, but also enable people to do what we brought them in to do in the most effective way possible too. Ali, over to you.
Okay, so moving on to what we implemented. So based on our initial thoughts and our strategies, what is it that we actually implemented? So we brought back recruitment. Obviously, with all of the work that Jamie's described there, and demand for BAs, it was really imperative that we actually kick-started our recruitment again. So we obviously went down the route of video interviews. So basically, very similar format to the way we'd done things when we were office-based. We did need to rethink some of our recruitment in terms of, we often give candidates exercises to do, scenarios, and leave them for 10, 15 minutes to look through that. So we had to rethink kind of the way we structure our interviews and how we got information to them before the interviews. But we managed to get around any of the hurdles that we came across, and we've made it work. So I'll talk a bit more about kind of the recruitment side in a moment, but also one of the other key areas we implemented was onboarding digitally. So we did virtual events. Typically, our onboarding, as Jamie mentioned, was done more at a local level by your team. You'd be welcomed on your first day by your team, meet everyone within that team and the teams around you, learn a bit more about the organisation. And then there tended to be a couple of months in kind of a big induction event face-to-face based in one of the hubs. So we rethought our approach to that and how we could give our new starters an equally good experience, but just different. So we focused more on our inductions about what we could offer them as a practice team. So what kind of training opportunities there might be, what learning and development, what other kind of opportunities we could help them with in terms of mentors. So we were able to talk through them, through things like that with them, and also actually introduce them to some of the key functions within DWP. So you can imagine if you join and you're working remotely, it's a very big organisation to get your head around. And if you're based just at home on your own, how do you kind of approach finding out more? So we got some of our BAs from different functional areas to talk through, give us a brief overview of what it was that they did in each of their areas, so that people had a bit of an insight kind of within the first few weeks and didn't feel completely bamboozled by kind of talk of different areas and different acronyms and terms. So the next thing we implemented was virtual community events. So obviously we couldn't do something based face-to-face anymore. So we did talk through, well, actually, is it worth having community events just virtually, but based on location? And actually, we came to the conclusion, if we're going to do something virtually, we may as well involve the whole of the hubs, so all of the different locations, all of the different BAs. So we wanted to create virtual cross-community events, share and learn, quizzes, and we wanted to be able to invite everyone to those. Okay. So we also implemented virtual training. So as our providers started to get more geared up to moving their training online, we took up those offerings and we started to put people through almost as a test to start with, but we put people through a number of different courses and got feedback on actually how did people find that kind of experience based virtually as opposed to being face-to-face in a classroom. And generally the feedback was really positive. Obviously virtual training might not suit everybody all of the time, but given the circumstances we were in, it was really positive feedback that we got. And then the apprenticeship. So we actually did quite a big undertaking, given that it was during COVID times, but we launched an apprenticeship. So that was everything from choosing the supplier, getting them on board, running recruitment campaigns, interviewing, onboarding 8 apprentices within 4 different functional areas. And now we're delivering that programme virtually. So those apprentices are all embedded within teams. They have mentors. We have virtual catch-ups regularly. So quite a big undertaking for us to kind of do all of that in a virtual kind of environment. So what were the benefits of it? So recruitment wise, for me, I do a lot of recruitment, and I found, to be honest, a real benefit in actually doing virtual recruitment. So really helped us with the diversity in our panels. So previously you were kind of subjected to whoever was available on a date in a location could be on your panel, within reason, obviously. But being able to recruit virtually means we can get the right people on the right panels at the right times. It's much more easily done. A lot less logistics. Try booking a meeting room in any of our hub locations in a busy time of the week, and you've got no chance. So imagine trying to book back-to-back interviews over the period of a week. So those kind of logistics gone. It's great. Time saving. So time saving in terms of the interviewees' time, in terms of travel and getting there. Time saving for us. If you've ever been to certainly our Newcastle DWP site, it takes 20 minutes to walk across to reception to collect someone for an interview. So massive time saving and saving on my shoes. Also much more flexible. So we've been able to offer more suitable times for interviews. We haven't had to cram them all within the kind of 10 till sort of 2:30, 3 kind of bracket. We have been able to extend them to slightly different times of the day, which suit people more. And on top of that, we still managed to recruit 50+ people during the pandemic. So it has been a success, and I'll talk more later about some of the things we'll carry on. Also onboarding. So the practice-wide induction events allowed us to bring lots of variety in terms of speakers. So previously, face-to-face, you did get to meet people face-to-face, which nothing can kind of take away from that. But actually, in terms of getting access to speakers from lots of different functions and practices who can give you an overview of what they do, then actually running these virtual events has been a real eye-opener in terms of what we can do within a short space of time. Okay, and then the benefits in our community events. So we actually, through doing these virtual events, we actually got much more engagement. So we tended to discover that actually when people are working at home and they haven't got to sort of get up and move away from the desk and go to a specific building or meeting room for a community event, that actually just between meetings they log on, kind of join that community event or that community share and learn, then actually a lot more people were keen to do that. So whether that be because it's easier for them or just a bit more flexible in terms of, you don't have to be in that specific location, whatever the reasons, our engagement really increased during this time. We're also able to put on a lot more frequent events. So we were pooling knowledge across all the different hubs. So we had a lot more ideas about things that we wanted to run. We didn't need to run them in individual locations. So obviously, we have speakers and we're sharing across the whole community. So we're able to put on a lot more events, lots of different topics. The breadth of topics really increased. And it just meant that everyone got more of a level playing field in terms of kind of their access to these sort of events. It wasn't kind of based on where you happen to be located. And again, with virtual training and conferences, much more inclusive actually. So we have a number of people within our community who struggle to attend training courses, so we'll offer them out, and quite often it's down to home commitments, children, caring responsibilities, all kinds of different things. But for some people it's just very, very difficult to be away from home for a couple of nights for a training course. So this has made it a lot more inclusive. People are able to join the course during the normal working day and take the exam at a time that suits them. So great in terms of inclusivity, also in terms of costs. So it's obviously cheaper in terms of the travel and subsistence for us. It's cheaper costs for the actual courses because the training providers can pass on reduced fees when they're not running them from specific book locations. And it also meant that actually we can use our training budget or eke it out more for more kind of coverage for our BAs, which is all excellent. Okay, I'm going to pass over to you, Jamie.
Cheers, Ollie. So yeah, I think a couple of things on there. Networking. Weirdly, one of the things that we saw decline the most immediately after COVID is probably one of the biggest benefits we've now seen moving to a fully sort of virtual community. So rather than people maybe sort of being constrained in terms of geography or technology, not allowing us to collaborate more widely. Networking is significantly increased, and we've seen that through various bits of insight we've gathered in terms of people now that their own networks have significantly increased. And I think that's partly down to one, actually, you know, we've got a huge sort of scale of people, but also a huge diversity of people. And I think actually having the opportunity now to network with a wider group of people has meant that actually there's a necessity sometimes through work, but they can actually get in contact with them easily because technology allows that. But also there might just be people in the community who maybe come from a similar background. They find it easiest to talk to them, or there might be people that they can support in a sort of mentoring capacity, and that's really evolved for us. And I would say if there's one of the biggest standout benefits, that is it. Similarly, we've been able to increase our collaboration with other organisations. So many sort of similar points as to why people find it difficult to go on training courses or conferences before, in terms of travel, in terms of getting a train from Newcastle to London or vice versa, allowed us to use our networks both across government, but also in private sector, to share experiences, to share techniques, to share how we deliver digital services to people, and whether that's citizens across government or whether that's customers elsewhere. We've done a lot of pairing up with a big number of organisations to bring people in, and for us to go and talk in other organisations too, to share what we're doing and how we're doing it. Similarly, I'd say if I was to pick out another particular benefit what we've seen as a community, again, one that was significantly declining to start off with, is that sense of belonging. And I think a big part of that is absolutely down to there's more opportunities for people to build up their own networks. But there is also partly down to increased activity within the community. So more people feel comfortable to come along and talk about a particular thing or to ask questions and participate. And I think that then raises the profile of people to go, oh, so-and-so's talking about this. Actually, I'd really like to know more around that. I might get in contact with them and I can find out more. And also, I know this is touched on, I think, in almost every other presentation, but we've certainly seen this ourselves, is actually you get to sort of know people better. So yes, you get to meet people's children, you get to meet people's dogs and cats, you get to know their names, you can hear the dog drinking the water sometimes in the background. You get that real sort of sense of immersion into people's lives you wouldn't necessarily get working when we're back in the office. Yes, you get a sense of people's interior design, and you also get a sense of people's quiz abilities or lack of quiz abilities in my case. So I think you can really connect on a deeper level, on a more human level, rather than that, just professional connections. What challenges have we faced? So obviously we've wanted this really to be more of a positive message, sharing, yes, actually, yeah, COVID has been crap. There has been huge interruptions in all of our lives, and not necessarily for the better, but there's also been hugely positive things that we've seen, and that's what we want to focus today on. But it wouldn't feel necessarily balanced unless we called out some of the challenges we faced too. So some of those will be very, very familiar, I think, to most people in most organisations. People's well-being, has been the top one, I think, for almost every organisation, and probably every person in every organisation. It's tough, and it continues to be tough. Some people have certainly got more into the rhythm and swing a bit, but we still continue that pastoral support, and we see that as being a really, really big part of our roles as leaders. And that's not just within the business analysis profession, but within other communities and professions within DWP and across government too. We acknowledge, and I think, are more patient and tolerant of the stresses of working from home. So you get to meet people's kids and pets and everything else. And actually, if there is a disruption, I think people's patience has increased. But certainly to start off with, it can take quite a little while to get used to. And similarly, we've seen huge challenges in the demand for our work. So demand for digital services that helps our citizens has skyrocketed, and that's true in many areas of government. So obviously that increased demand alongside everything else going off is something that we've had to really carefully manage and still continue to do so. You know, we need to obviously be looking out for people. We want people to absolutely feel supported, and balancing that with delivery can be a real challenge at times. And yeah, you know, lack of human interaction. You know, some people in particular, more than others, have really struggled with some of those conversations that you absolutely don't have virtually, or struggle to have. I think we've become better at having sort of informal sort of coffee and catch-up type things and fikas and everything else. But that still doesn't beat nipping out and grabbing a sandwich with someone, or it still doesn't beat nipping for a pint after work with the team. But obviously, I think people have found better ways to cope with that. People have found better ways to put alternatives in place. But I think, as people have mentioned before, you know, having a pint, sitting at an office at room staring to screen does not beat going with colleagues to somewhere that's a nice trendy bar near work. Other challenges we've faced, absolutely, new starters. There's nothing like meeting your team face to face, and I think that can be harder for different people. I think if you're coming into a new role that you know them before, particularly someone more junior in a particular profession, then coming to a new organisation and working with a new team, that can be really daunting. And we've certainly got better at putting those inductions in place, and actually we can share a lot more knowledge and help people to be introduced to more people than they maybe would have been before. But it still doesn't meet, it doesn't feel like the same way as meeting someone face to face. Similarly, as professionals, we found it really difficult to do elements of our job. Bringing people together to understand problems and assess options in often sort of very complex areas in delivering digital services is a huge part of what we do. So having to adapt to that and find new ways to do that has been really challenging. Facilitating sessions is one of those things where sometimes it's still much easier just to use post-it notes on a wall and move things around. But I think with the technology like Miro that we've adopted, that can certainly also have a huge amount of positives, that everyone can see the same screen. You're not trying to fight to look over someone's shoulder, but also you haven't got the hassle of then taking that down and taking it with you. It's already there. Anyone can come back to it at any point in time. And similarly, it can be difficult to read the room, particularly if people have got their cameras off. It can be really difficult to get some of those non-verbal language cues, which are really important when you are delivering change and delivering things that will impact people. And similarly, it can be really difficult, even with a camera sometimes, to gauge the sort of wider room atmosphere in response to something. So there's certainly ways that we have found positive, which we started sharing with our profession and our community, and vice versa, what our profession members have been sharing wider too. But that necessarily isn't sometimes the best place for some more sensitive conversations that may need to be had. And that's it from me. I'll hand over to Ali for the last couple of slides.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, so I'll be very quick on these two. So what are we going to keep after COVID? So some of the things that we implemented have really worked well, and we want to keep elements of those going forward. So interviewing, whether we do full interviews, the whole campaign virtually, or whether we do kind of first interviews or something similar, but we're definitely going to keep some of our elements of virtual interviewing. It's been great. We'll definitely keep a lot of our community events running virtually, because it does allow for more people to join. It allows us to kind of reach more people and share more information across all of the different hubs. So definitely going to keep elements of those. And we're definitely going to keep some training virtual. So I imagine that we will go back to some face-to-face training, because actually that suits some people much more. However, in order to be able to engage everyone and let everyone have the same opportunities, we'll definitely have elements of virtual training available for people. And then some of the other things, so as I've just said, some training will go back to face-to-face classroom. We will find hybrid ways of working. So I think going forward, we are going to be working in a hybrid manner. So we want to find a way that approach that works best for both DWP and individuals. So potentially coming in for specific events and specific collaboration sessions, but actually also having that opportunity to have quieter time at home, kind of getting on with work with that flexibility of different start and end times. And also new starters. So we keep talking about it would be great to meet your team face to face. So it would be lovely on a new starter's first day to actually get them in the office, meet their team, whether they then go to working hybridly or coming in the office once or twice a week, then fine. But they've actually had that initial meeting. They know what people look like. They can place different people. They can kind of place the collaborative spaces and know kind of where they fit. And finally, real social events. So nothing beats actually meeting up with your colleagues for a real beer rather than sitting on the end of a Zoom call. So we're definitely going to look to implement some more of those going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. That's brilliant. I'll take the screen back. And then that should be, I think we're all back here. Now, I'm very conscious of time. Thank you very much for those presentations. There's a theme emerging. Well, there's twin themes emerging from what you've been saying and from the questions and comments that we've been getting in. One difficult one has been centered on mental health and people's well-being. Now, that's a huge area that we could spend a lot of time addressing. We haven't got that time, so I'm going to put that to one side for the moment. The other one, and it emerges as an issue very frequently when we run any event that is anything to do with leadership, is change management and people. And the theme that's come out, and in particular, Mark was talking about this in his team's example, is that a crisis meant that there was very little resistance to change. And so bringing together a few of the different questions that we've had, can we explore very briefly, perhaps, the impact that the COVID crisis has had on change management going forward? I'm not perhaps necessarily suggesting that we create another COVID, plainly, but crises have their uses, perhaps, for leaders of change. Helen, what do you make of that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The pressure, I mean, funnily enough, we've been involved in this kind of discussion for some years, and it's only been in the last year that we've got such a lot of traction from organisations. I think Matt would probably agree with that. That, you know, all of a sudden a crisis creates a need for change, and people really buy into that. And I think the issues around leadership and change that you talk about are really, really important ones. I think people, you know, they use role models. They want to see people doing things that they can replicate. But I think also, you know, I would say that the system around change needs to support change too. So it's all very well sort of talking about change and leadership and the people side of things, which is so important. But I think you know, we need to build infrastructures that support and encourage change as well.
Anna, what's your take on this question?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot in change management. It seems to be much more emphasis on it now. We've found that, and I think it's the same even pre-COVID, but if people are embarking in engaging and actually being a part of defining what that change looks like, we tend to find we get much greater traction. So it's almost like pushing on an open door. That being said, even though the pandemic has helped push people in the right direction for this, you know, I'm still having regular calls, like including today, from people who feel, well, I just want to come out of a pandemic which has been incredibly stressful for me, and I just want to go back to something familiar and comfortable. And the thoughts of doing something different is challenging. So I would say when we measure it, we start the process at about 20% with some form of, not resistance sounds terrible, but with people who perhaps need greater support to transition. It will end probably, you know, with about 5 or 6%. But we still see there is resistance there in some areas, but not maybe as great as it could have been.
Mark, your take.
Yeah, so I do agree with Anna. I think that there is still a lot to do here, and that you're always going to have people who resist change. You're always going to have that, because it is in our nature to stick to what we're comfortable with and to what we know. But it is also genetically in our nature to adapt around change. In terms of change management, in terms of office space, and in terms of work, I think Helen mentioned when she was going through a discussion earlier about flexibility within a structure. It might have actually been Hannah. I could be getting that wrong, but about flexibility within a structure. And I think that, for me as a manager, I've seen the most engagement and the most collaboration when you offer a structure and give people the choice about how much they change within it. Give people some of the control over that change. People hate change to be thrust upon them, but if they can be a part of it, or they can take it at their own pace, and it's a different thing you're dealing with. So for me, I think it is the idea of having a structure with flexibility within it, and I think I absolutely agree with that. I think it was Helen or Hannah, I can't remember which one mentioned it earlier.
Thank you for that. Again, I'm very conscious of the time. Perhaps just 2 more minutes on a different subsidiary theme that's been coming through from our audience. One of the reasons that is often expressed, or at least understood by leaders when they hear it, this view expressed, that for predicting, insisting on, requiring a return to the office, a return to pre-COVID normality, is based around control. Control of people's routine, presenteeism, control of how things are communicated, and so forth. And one of the features of the COVID period was, of course, the race to remote working that everybody achieved far quicker than they ever thought possible. But also the multiplicity of channels, of back channels, the backstory to the meeting that Helen was talking about. What sort of levels of control do you think organizations are going to want to exert over those back channels? Do you think they'll ever succeed? Do you think they ought to? Jamie, what do you make of that?
I think as in our profession, as well as business analysts and people working in digital environments, I think actually some of those conversations are really helpful, but it doesn't mean it have to exclusively happen in a physical face-to-face setting. I know a lot of colleagues, a lot of people, both where I work now, where I worked previously, still keep in contact. You haven't got to keep in contact necessarily at a water cooler. You haven't got to necessarily keep in contact by making a coffee. You can do that at home still over a call. Does it mean it needs to be more planned? Yes, possibly. Sometimes harder sometimes find space in people's calendars at the moment and everything else. But I still think that can certainly happen. I think it's about how people make that space to make it happen is probably the main thing.
Matt, 20 seconds on that.
Yeah, I think we're kidding ourselves if we think the companies haven't been exerting control when people haven't been in the office. I think in terms of some of the software that's been used to measure performance and interactions and kind of time spent on systems, I think that's one thing to say. Second, I think it's just people will find ways of communicating under the radar regardless of what you put in place. So if you put surveillance in place on some of the mandated systems, people switch to something else. We'll find workarounds. I think the thing that concerns me a little bit over this past year is I think the amplification of cliques and the fact that we settle into those kind of networks that people already know, and whether that's on WhatsApp or email or other kind of ways of meeting up maybe locally to people that you know near where you live. I think that's something that actually the office can help to overcome in terms of actually leveling that in terms of access and presence and so on, and helping people break into different networks. So I think that's really important to look at.
Thank you, Matt. There are many other issues that we could have covered, but we've run out of time. Thank you very much to all our speakers for a fascinating and deeply thought-provoking session. There's a great deal for us all to take away from these presentations. We will share the recording in the next day or two. And in the meantime, do please complete the survey when you close this session, or if you prefer, the survey link will be sent out in an email later this evening. I hope you've enjoyed this IT Leaders Forum. Thank you for attending. Thank you again very much indeed to all our speakers. and goodbye.
Thank you.